The political and legal development of Western nations, particularly the United States, reveals a pattern of accumulated errors originating from the earliest periods of nation-building. The founding framework established a republic grounded in principles of liberty and limited government, yet it contained unresolved tensions that later generations failed to address constructively. Instead of pragmatic adjustments to maintain cultural and demographic stability, subsequent leaders introduced expansive changes that altered the character of the nation and its people. These interventions prioritized abstract notions of fairness and equality over the practical imperatives of self-preservation, personal liberty, and continuity for the historic population. This trajectory of policy accumulation has produced a society burdened by layers of legislation that undermine the very foundations they claimed to improve. Laws concerning citizenship, voting, and immigration have systematically eroded the homogeneity and cohesion that once defined white Western culture. Amendments and statutes enacted under conditions of duress, coercion, and corruption have reshaped constitutional understandings in ways that lack legitimate grounding in the original framework. The result is a compounded mess of rules that subjectively applied and frequently abused, generating chaos across institutions and daily life while imposing demographic replacement on the descendants of the founding peoples. Contemporary historical perspective exposes the full extent of these failures. Past leaders operated with limited foresight yet pursued grandiose moral posturing that served short-term gains in power, money, and ego. Their decisions have left current generations confronting the consequences of inherited stupidity. Reverence for these figures perpetuates the damage by discouraging scrutiny and correction. The patterns of elite behavior demonstrate a consistent cycle where each cohort of politicians replicates and amplifies the mistakes of predecessors, transforming initial flaws into existential threats to the survival of white Western civilization. The foundational framework and its subsequent drift. The American founding provided a coherent structure emphasizing individual liberty, self-sufficiency, and republican governance suited to a relatively homogeneous citizenry. This base offered immense potential for stability and prosperity when preserved with restraint. However, later generations veered sharply from this path by layering interventions that expanded federal authority and introduced mandates disconnected from the original intent. These deviations compounded over time as politicians avoided fixing core issues and instead pursued expansive programs that destabilized the system. Unresolved matters from the founding era received inadequate attention, allowing fissures to widen into fundamental transformations. Successive leaders proved incapable of measured resolution, opting instead for grandstanding measures that altered the nation's ethnic and cultural composition. The populace often acquiesced under state pressure or ideological conditioning, internalizing flawed ideals that justified further erosion of traditional safeguards. This process created a self-reinforcing dynamic where authority imposed its will against the interests of the historic majority. The drift away from foundational principles has manifested in every domain of governance. Policies that could have maintained continuity gave way to experiments in universalism that disregarded human nature, group dynamics, and historical realities. Each increment of change built upon prior errors, producing an overarching stupidity that permeates institutions and public understanding. The outcome is a society where inherited laws dictate a path of destruction rather than preservation for the people who built the nation. Reconstruction Amendments and Constitutional Corruption. The Reconstruction Amendments represent a pivotal moment of overreach that fundamentally corrupted the constitutional order. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified amid duress and coercion following the Civil War, with Southern states compelled to accept them as conditions for reintegration. These measures had no proper place within the original constitutional design and introduced expansive reinterpretations of citizenship and rights that opened doors to later abuses. Their passage under corrupt political conditions altered the balance of power and set precedents for federal dominance over the historic population. The 14th Amendment in particular enabled broad judicial expansions that stretched far beyond any original context, facilitating birthright citizenship claims and equal protection doctrines that disadvantaged the majority. Combined with the other amendments, these changes disrupted the homogeneity and natural congruence of white Western culture across the United States and influenced global developments. What began as responses to specific circumstances evolved into tools for ongoing transformation that no prudent framework required. The recklessness of these alterations produced enduring damage to the nation's character and demographic integrity. Such constitutional manipulations established a template for future leaders to exploit. The amendments empowered subsequent waves of legislation that treated the Constitution as an instrument for social engineering rather than a guardian of liberty. This legacy of corruption continues to bind contemporary society to flawed provisions that prioritize abstract equality over the self-preservation of the founding peoples. Scrutiny reveals these amendments as destructive interventions rather than enlightened advances. Immigration policies and demographic replacement. Immigration laws enacted over decades progressively opened borders in unnecessary and harmful ways that no genuine national interest demanded. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act and its expansions shifted priorities away from maintaining the existing population balance toward chain migration and mass inflows from distant regions. These policies flooded the country with demographic changes that eroded the majority status of white Americans, and parallel developments occurred across white Western nations. The alterations were sold through deception and false assurances, yet delivered replacement-level transformations. Subsequent adjustments to citizenship and voting rules compounded the initial errors by creating pathways for political exploitation through imported populations. Leaders repeatedly expanded these systems to serve electoral advantages, cheap labor interests, and moral signaling while disregarding the impacts on social trust, public resources, and cultural continuity. The unnecessary scale of immigration generated problems in housing, education, welfare, and cohesion that continue to strain the historic nation. These policies formed part of a deliberate cycle where short-sighted elites sacrificed future generations for immediate gains. The demographic consequences now confront white populations with minority status in their ancestral homelands. This replacement stems directly from the compounded stupidity of immigration frameworks that treated nations as open hotels rather than inherited homelands. Historical perspective confirms that restraint and preservation would have avoided these outcomes entirely. The laws stand as monuments to elite failure and a direct assault on the continuity of white Western peoples. Civil rights expansions and subversive mandates. Civil rights legislation and its extensions introduced layers of mandates that evolved into instruments of subversion against the majority population. What began with prohibitions on discrimination expanded into affirmative action, disparate impact rules, hate crime enhancements, and diversity, equity, and inclusion regimes. These frameworks operate through subjective application and systematic abuse, punishing competence while rewarding dysfunction and division. They function as tools for undermining white Western culture under guises of compassion and fairness. The drivel of subsequent rules created parallel legal standards that erode merit, freedom of association, and equal treatment before the law. DEI initiatives and related acronyms mask ulterior motivations of control, resource redistribution, and cultural erasure. These policies never addressed genuine needs but instead manufactured grievances and dependencies that fracture social cohesion. The insanity of such systems lies in their consistent application against the historic builders of the society they claim to improve. This expansionist approach to civil rights produced chaos across institutions by institutionalizing group-based preferences over individual liberty. Leaders could not resist the temptation to intervene further, each edition deepening the compounded failures inherited from prior eras. The result is a legal environment hostile to the self-sufficiency and preservation instincts of white populations. These mandates exemplify the destructive pomposity of politicians who prioritize dominion over stewardship. The cycle of elite failure and institutional self-oppression. Political classes across generations have consisted of frauds, phonies, and morons who replicate patterns of grandstanding and corruption. These elites gain power through deception and maintain it through policies that oppress their own people, ethnicity, and culture. State authority in white Western countries has repeatedly turned inward against the historic majority, imposing will through coercive mechanisms that serve no constructive purpose. This self-oppression manifests in laws that undermine fertility, identity, and continuity while enriching the ruling stratum. Each cohort learns from predecessors, compounding lies, pomposity, and destructive decisions into ever greater failures. Current leaders repeat talking points and agendas for money, power, and ego, cloaking their actions in false narratives of caring and compassion. They know their rotten nature yet project greatness while continuing the cycle that previous generations initiated. The populace, conditioned by authority and propaganda, often regurgitates the nonsense, perpetuating reverence for figures who merit only condemnation. This institutional dynamic has produced a complete mess where sane governance appears impossible. The traitorous class operates with consistent stupidity, expanding bad policies and blocking correction. Their craving for authority and admiration drives endless interventions that ruin what should have remained untouched. Recognition of this cycle demands rejection of inherited myths and assertion of realistic priorities centered on the survival of the people. Conclusion. The accumulated body of terrible laws and policies has created an existential crisis for white Western civilization that requires unflinching acknowledgement. Past leaders bear responsibility for the destructive choices that prioritized ego, power, and abstract ideals over the concrete welfare and continuity of their descendants. Their short-sightedness and corruption have left contemporary generations with the burden of reversal and restoration. Historical perspective now available makes clear the full extent of these failures and the necessity of discarding reverence for those who caused them. Scrutiny of the entire record reveals a consistent pattern of elite incompetence and self-interest that compounded from founding compromises through Reconstruction, immigration expansions, and civil rights overreach. No element of this trajectory was inevitable or necessary. Restraint at each stage would have preserved the homogeneity, liberty, and prosperity that defined the West. The current chaos of subjective laws, demographic replacement, and cultural subversion stems directly from this unbroken chain of folly. The path forward lies in realistic assessment and unapologetic assertion of continuity for white peoples. Rejection of past delusions enables focus on self-preservation, family formation, border integrity, and merit-based systems. Truthful reckoning with the frauds and morons of history frees living generations to secure their destiny rather than submit to inherited destruction. This recognition forms the essential foundation for renewal and endurance of the historic nations.